All right, so before we get into the mechanics of streams, let's talk about what they are and what they mean. So a stream is basically, think of it kind of like an array of bytes that you can read either in chunks and may theoretically have no end, or you can think of it as, I always like to kind of visualize it like one of those little bank drive-through things where you stick the tube in and push the button and it does that and then comes back. They're kind of like that. So basically you're establishing a connection to something. In our case, it's going to be a web server, but it could just be a file on the disk. It could be, you could actually attach and build a stream to a memory space. So if you want to take some text or some data and save it into memory somewhere and use it somewhere else, you can do that. Reading XML documents, anything. So a stream is a construct that lives inside of system.io, which is input-output stream. And it's a base class. You actually cannot create an instance of it. So if I do a Alt F12, you'll see it's an abstract class. The abstract keyword basically means that you must inherit it. Luckily for us, most of our streams are already inherited, and they're basically used as a building block or a tool for a piece of functionality. So the idea here is that we're going to type in a website URL, parse the URL, request the URL, i.e. website. We're going to capture the response object, capture the response stream, convert the stream to a buffer, which is just a byte array, and then convert the byte array to a string. Output string to screen. Okay? So that's all we're going to do. Nothing overly dramatic, but it's some steps. So the first thing we need to do, we'll do some variables, then we have to do a prompt. So I'm going to set up a string, which is my string URL. I'm then going to do a console.writeLine, website address, and then string URL will be console.readLine. So basically we're just capturing whatever's typed in there. Then the next step, oh, that's this step here. So then we want to parse the URL. So within system.uri, there's a system.uri class, which is a universal resource identifier. URL is a universal resource locator. URLs are a subset of URIs / they replace them. Basically, URI and URL are the same thing. Okay. So we'll call this the actual URL variable. System.uri has a function, has a lot of static functions, but we can use the one that's called try_create. I believe this one. Yeah, so this takes in a series of parameters, and the parameters are the URI string, which is what we'll get from the console, and then it wants to know the kind of URI that we're expecting. And then we have the out URI, which is the result. And this is one of those try type methods, so it'll actually return a Boolean, whether it's able to successfully parse or not. And that's the whole goal there. So what we'll say is string URL, comma, then the kind is what's called an enumerator. It's a predefined constant set that has a specialized name. So instead of us having to go in and say as a string relative or absolute, we just say URI kind dot, and then we have these what look like properties. And in our case, we're looking for an absolute URI. Absolute URIs are ones that start with HTTP : the domain name. Relative ones are simply things like /home. So we want our user to type in a full URL, not just the /home, which could be anything. And then we have these output parameters. So you'll see here it says out URI result. This is a special keyword that says that the parameter that I'm passing to this function is deemed an output parameter, which allows the function to actually store a value in that parameter, and then I get it back. So instead of having a return value, which this has a return value of a Boolean, so the function returns a Boolean, but it's also going to populate this variable that I pass in, and that becomes my output value. Fancy? So we go out, and then I'm going to use this URL variable that I declared. And that will attempt to parse. Now, the catch we run into here is that, what if this parse fails? We have to actually repeat those steps again. So to do that, I'm going to do a do loop. And I'll put my while around this. And basically, I'll say, while you're unable to parse the URI, loop. Now, I have a scope issue, so I'll have to move this string, or I'm sorry, not this string, this variable up here. And then that will be the step of parsing. And then I do need that semicolon. Okay.
I don't get the out part.
The out part?
Yeah, the out URL.
Like why out, or
like you just created the URL object and then, but is it anything or what is it?
All right. No, that's actually a good question. So at this point, it's nothing. We can basically say null. So it's null. It's undefined, doesn't have any value. When I pass it in here, it's still null. But it's passing. What it's really passing is it's saying, function, here's that memory address, put something in it. So it becomes that bucket or that place that I want the URI stored. Does that make sense?
So you're creating it with that function of try create.
Yes.
Okay.
The URI ultimately gets created by calling this function.
Okay.
So once this function is done executing, there will be a value in there, assuming that it parses successfully.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and let's just run that to see what that looks like. So website address. So what it's expecting is something like this. And when I hit enter, if it's successful, it'll just close the app. If I put in a bad one, like home, it just comes back and says, and you know, it just keeps prompting. If we wanted to make it more complex, we could actually do this step inside of the while loop. And we can say if not good parse, then console.write invalid URL. This variable has to live outside of the do loop because I'm getting squiggles down in my while.
Why does it give you a Boolean option and a bool option? You write out the whole thing. Is there a difference?
There is not a difference. So the Boolean is actually the runtime type. Boolean, the full word. The bool is a C# keyword that maps directly to Boolean.
Okay.
So it's there for
To save 3 characters.
to save 3 characters, but it's really there because all of the types within the runtime are fully identifiable. Like your integer, your int, is actually an int32. It's a 32-bit integer, always is. But the int keyword is common nomenclature from C and C++. So they're carrying those conventions so that someone who knows C or C++ or Java can come in and just type int I and it'll work because they're carrying that previous experience into the language. Nobody really types int32, so it is kind of unnecessary, but it's just strong documentation. So, if you're using Visual Basic, there's actually a mapping the other way because in Visual Basic, the type is referred to as integer. It's actually the full word integer. And Booleans are Boolean. So, all right, so let's run this one more time. So if we do a bad URL, it'll come up, ooh, invalid URL. That looks ugly. Invalid URL, website address. We can type it in again, and it accepts it. So we've at least got that parsing piece figured out.
How does absolute test, does it just look for HTTP?
Basically, so the general convention for any URI is that you have protocol : / domain address. That's the format of any URI. So whether it's FTP, HTTP, SMTP, that doesn't really count. But typically the convention is protocol : / domain name : port number / relative path. So it's looking for that front piece. And without it being there, it's not a valid URL.